They score! They score!
Welcome to God's Playbook with your host, Father Rico Passero.
Lock at the 20, 10, 5, touchdown! Touchdown!
Let's play ball.
Friends, welcome back to God's Playbook. Today is a day the Lord has made, and what a blessing to have one of my brothers here, a diocesan brother, Father Michael Basque, who is a diocesan priest for the Diocese of St. Catharines. Father Michael, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Father Michael, our listeners are dying to find out about your path to the priesthood. So why don't we start by asking you the question, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, your background, that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, I was born at Oshawa, Ontario, the south end, the working end class end of town, in 1958. And I grew up in a very, what you might call, conventional Catholic family. My parents were married in the church. My brother and I were baptized and made our first confession, the first communion, confirmation. We went to Mass every Sunday, the Holy Day of Obligation. We go to confession usually every month or every second month. So, back then that was kind of pretty well what I call conventional. We went to Catholic school up to the end of grade 8. So, it was a very conventional family experience. My dad worked at the parish bingo, which was the fundraiser, because they just put a new addition on Holy Cross Church in Oshawa, where I grew up. And Mom would make stuff for the Catholic Women's League bake sale, stuff like that. So it was pretty conventional.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been pretty strong in my faith. And as a kid, you learned about your faith. My parents had a very limited education, grade 7. So I'd ask them questions about my faith, and they would try to answer them. And if they couldn't answer them, they'd always call on the priest. And, why don't you ask Father when we go to Mass on Sunday? And I would usually do that.
Yes.
And the first part of my childhood, mostly in elementary school, our pastor was a very, again, kind of conventional priest, a very good man, but you never saw him when he wasn't wearing a black suit and a black fedora hat. That was my one strong memory of him.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very kind man, very good administrator. He's the one that oversaw the building project, the expansion of our parish, Holy Cross in Oshawa. And he helped to start the fundraising that paid off the debt. And so my view of priesthood was very, very formal, very kind of static. And as a child, that was very typical when I grew up in the 60s. That was how a lot of priests were, even though Vatican II had happened and things were starting to change. It was still very traditional.
Okay.
I always felt, and this has probably been my biggest obstacle to wanting to be a priest or thinking I was called to be a priest, was I always thought priests had to be really holy, that they would fold their hands and they'd pray all day and they would never swear. They were always, well put together, whatever. So my image of what a priest should be or could be when I was young was very static, very kind of fixed. When I got to high school, things changed a little bit. By that time, I was asking more difficult questions. My parents were having a hard time answering them. The other issue that really got me was I was very interested in science. In grade 9, we took about evolution. And Darwin's theory of evolution said one thing, and the Bible said the world was created in 6 days. Darwin said it was a lot longer than that. How do you resolve issues like that? That's an example of kind of issues that I was coming to grips with.
Yes.
And we got a new pastor. He was a former professor at St. Augustine Seminary, and his brother was a priest in this diocese. And, I'd have conversations with him. He didn't walk around in a black suit all the time. Now, most of the time, of course, he was very formal, but you'd see him in just a regular sweater and shirt and whatever sometimes. And so it was a much more relaxed kind of picture of priesthood that I was beginning to develop.
Yes.
And he would, I'd ask him questions back at the church. And he had colleagues of his at St. Augustine Seminary, where he taught, who would come and help out on weekends. And so I started to talk to some of them. And I'd start asking them the questions. And they'd say, well, listen, why don't you come by the office sometime, Saturday afternoon or whatever, and, we'll chat some more. So there were times when I think I kept them there for over 2 hours.
Wow.
Just pumping them full of questions about this, that. How could this be true and that be true? And how do you understand it? So my faith was changing. At the same time, my vision of priesthood was changing, because here was a guy, a priest, who wasn't always that formal, static picture. He would laugh and he'd come down. When I started working at the bingo with my father, he would come down. We'd have a lunch after the bingo and he would chitter chatter away. And I was like, these priests are human. And then I think a year later, there was another priest that came and he became the head of the field education department at St. Augustine's for years. He came there as a deacon. So he spent a year as a deacon. And one day he comes to school and at recess, he comes out and plays soccer with us. And then one day, the deacon comes to our school and, he goes around, visits classrooms. Well, you kind of expect that, right? And then at recess, he goes outside. Now, he's not wearing blacks at this time. He goes outside and he plays soccer with us. We thought this was wild.
Yeah.
The guy's a deacon. He's playing soccer with us. And then he was ordained a year later as a priest, and he was assigned to our parish for 3, maybe 4 years as the associate. And he would come to our school once in a while and he would play soccer. All of a sudden, wow, priests are allowed to play soccer?
I know.
Priests are allowed to be like the rest of us?
Shocking.
And so the world of my faith was changing, but also the vision of what a priest did changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would have been like grade 7, grade 8. And then going into grade 9 and grade 10, that's when I began struggling with the evolution question and other things like that. And as I said, these professors started to answer my questions. And it's funny because I had a real struggling period for about 2 years. From the beginning of grade 10 till about the beginning of grade 12, I was really struggling with my faith. The childhood faith I'd grown up with wasn't working. And I needed an adult faith. And I remember in grade 12, because I'd stopped going to communion for a little while. They kept telling me to go to communion, but I didn't feel like I felt like a hypocrite because I did take my faith seriously. I never stopped going to church. Anyway, what happened was early part of grade 12, it all snapped into place. And from that point on, I've never really looked back in terms of my faith. Okay. I've had an adult faith, and it's what's kept me going through good times and bad times. But during my high school years, as I said, I was talking to these priests and they were very personable. And I saw a different picture of priesthood. Now, at the time, I was still thinking about, every Catholic kid when I was growing up, every Catholic boy when I was growing up wanted to be a priest for about 2 weeks. And then he wanted to be like a fireman or a teacher or a doctor or something like that, right?
Right.
Well, I went through that phase, but that was like in grade 3 or grade 4. By the time I got into high school, I was thinking, priesthood, maybe it's not as ridiculous an idea as I thought it was originally. So after high school, I went to Queen's University. They had a very strong student parish, Thomas More Parish. And we were responsible for a lot of stuff. We had to set up the classroom for mass. We looked after a whole bunch of other things. So all of a sudden, I was an adult Catholic, but I was acting like one. I didn't think like one or feel like one. Yes. I was allowed to participate and, do readings at mass and do all sorts of things. I stayed at the Newman Center for the last 2 years of university. And the other thing was, I was very fortunate because I was hanging around with a group of people who were all taking their faith very seriously. They were kind of peers to me in that way, but also they were looking ahead. So one of them wanted to be a Catholic school teacher, and she actually did leave, and was a Catholic school teacher for a little while. Then she left that, and then I think she went into hospital chaplaincy or something else. Another young woman was interested in becoming a nun. So after university, she entered a religious community of women. She lasted about 2 years, then she left. We had another young guy who was going to join a religious community for men. That lasted about a year. Another guy, he was involved in the Scarborough Foreign Missions. He was all a social justice guy, right?
Yes.
Interested in foreign mission stuff. So he went to Peru and he was there for over 25 years.
Wow.
Before he came back. So I was surrounded by all these people who had found a way to connect their faith with what they were going to do with the rest of their life.
Yes.
And they'd look at me and say, what are you going to do? And I was like, that's a good question. I need to find an answer to that question. And I've always enjoyed writing. So I studied political science at Queen's, and I thought, well, I'll go into journalism. It's a way for me to marry my interest in writing with my interest in politics. And, somehow my faith would fit in with all of that.
Yes.
Well, after I graduated, I did take some journalism courses because I needed some specific technical training, which I did. Then I got a job, one in Eastern Ontario for about 2 months, and then another one in Northwestern Ontario for about 10 months. all throughout that time, though, there was something missing. I'd actually thought about when I left Queens, I'd actually approached St. Augustine Seminary, where I went to the seminary and asked them. And, at the beginning of the summer, I said, I'm kind of interested. And they said, well, think about it and come back and see us later. So I went back to see them later in the summer and I said, I think I want to work for all. He said, that's probably a good idea because it always helps to have a little bit of life experience before you make a commitment like entering the seminary, right?
I agree.
So then I got my first job in Eastern Ontario and I was there for a couple of months. And then I moved to another newspaper in Northwest Ontario. They offered me more money. Although I didn't realize how far away Atikokan, Ontario was from home.
Wow.
It was 180 miles west of Thunder Bay, which is a long way.
Wow.
And when you don't make a lot of money, getting home is not an option. So during that time, it was a very difficult time. I would say that's the most difficult period of my entire life. I had a real struggle, but it did force me to grow up, which is a good thing. But I think during that time at Queens, if you will, the seeds of my vocation were planted and they sort of sprouted there, but then they kind of grew underground when I was up north. And then when I came back from up north, I was looking for a job in another newspaper. I reached the point where I couldn't hack being so isolated anymore. So I came back hoping I could get another job writing, maybe even for a Catholic publication. That would be great. But in the back of my mind, there was always this thing gnawing away at me. It started at Queens. It continued through Atikokan. And it was like, I feel this call to the priesthood.
Good.
I don't understand it. I think it's crazy personally, because I kept looking at all these priests around me, guys going to seminary, and they were so holy and wonderful and whatever. And I was a little rough around the edges. I still am. But the thing is that I couldn't get it out of my system. So my name was on a list. And the vocations director at the time, the acting vocations director, one day out of the blue calls me and says, you were once sisters in the priesthood. I said, yes. Are you still interested? Well, I said, I haven't ruled out that possibility. He said, why don't you come into my office? We'll have a chat. We'll whatever. So I go in my office. We had a long chat. And, it was almost as if it was, I got to get this out of my system. Here's what I expected to happen. I was going to enter the seminary. At the end of a year, they were going to say, Michael, thank you for coming, but we don't think you have what it takes. So therefore, you can go on with your life. And I'd be released from all this, right? I would stop thinking about this silly idea that I could be a priest, right?
Right.
Or at least I thought it was silly at the time. So I went to the office, and I remember it was the day after my 25th birthday. It was October 7th, 1983. And I said, I'm going to try this. So I went to Sarah House in Toronto, which had just opened. I started in January. I had to take 5 courses of philosophy all at once. Never do that. Never take 5 courses of philosophy all at once if you can avoid it. But I had to. They said, you need these courses. I had to take actually 6. I had to take the other one first year at seminary. But I took my 5 courses. I was at Sarah House. I was learning to pray the Liturgy of the Hours. I went to Mass every day. We were involved in different things. And it's funny because over the course of those 4 months I spent at Sarah House, I was thinking, maybe this isn't such a crazy idea after all. Maybe God really wants me to do this. So at the end of the year, I get a recommendation. It was in May. They called me in the office. Father Sean O'Sullivan, who they named the theater after, was the director actually at the time.
Okay.
And he says to me, we think you've got a calling. We want to send you to St. Augustine Seminary. And I said, okay, fine. I was still a little leery thinking, really? Seriously? You're willing to work with a guy like me? But hey, it was at the point where I was beginning to see this as a real possibility. But there was still a little hesitation. And he said, the other thing he said, look, just go and discern. You're not signing up for the priesthood now. You don't do that till the day you're ordained, right? You discern, you decide. So I said, okay. So I went to St. Augustine's. I arrived in the fall. I remember the day clearly because I'm here. This is actually happening, right? So I start the program, and by first semester, second semester, everything went really well. At the end of first year, when I thought they were going to say, Michael, thank you for coming, but we think you probably were called to do something else. I got, Michael, we think you're called to be a priest. Well, this is when Monsignor Peter Somerville was director of St. Augustine. I remember him saying that specifically to me. I thought, this is more serious than I thought it was. Second year, we do pastoral year. I'll do a pastoral training course. It was at the Toronto East General Hospital at the time. And it was the first time you got kind of hands-on experience with what it would be like to be a priest. And it was nerve-wracking. It was maybe a little anxious, but like, yeah, I can do this. Yeah, I kind of like doing this. Yeah, maybe I'm called to do this. Second year finishes. They call me in and they say, Michael, we can see nothing but green lights between here and ordination. Wow. You're sure about this? There was one problem. And that has been my cross throughout my discernment, my seminary years, and my priesthood. I've always wanted to be a father, and I don't mean a priest, the other kind of father.
Yes.
I wanted to have a wife and kids. People often say priests know nothing about marriage. I beg to differ. I'm the product of what happens when marriage works really well. My parents had a wonderful marriage. They were wonderful parents. And the thing is that I saw what my father had, and I wanted that so badly.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the problem. Obviously, you can't do this and you can't do that.
That's right. You got to make a choice.
And I reached the point where I was feeling, now I was never seeing anybody on the side. I'd actually never had a serious girlfriend, but it was just this, could I do this for the rest of my life?
Mm-hmm.
What if I got ordained and fell in love with a woman? How could I handle that? Those to me were serious issues, because when I make a commitment, I make a commitment, right?
Yes.
Could I faithfully live this out? That was the question. That was the issue that I was struggling with. So I asked the seminary for a year off to think about it. And they said, really? Are you sure? My spiritual director at the time was very supportive. He said, it's probably good. Like, the fact that you're doing this now shows you understand the seriousness of the commitment you're making. And also it's going to prevent some disaster from happening 5 years after ordination, right?
Sure.
So I took the year off and I worked for a while. And I actually got a job working in the Archdiocese of Toronto offices. And during that time, I had 20 credits in theology already figured. I needed 30 to graduate. I said, I'm going to graduate with my degree, even if I don't. I was 2/3 of the way there already.
Mm-hmm.
And my thinking was, I at least want to finish my MDiv. So I took courses while I was out of the seminary.
Okay.
So I continued on for a year and a half. I went 18 months and I continued to take courses. I was racking them up. I was taking all the courses you had to have to get ordained, sacraments and all this other stuff. So the courses I was taking were all on track. So by the time I went back, like, they looked at me and said, what are we going to do with you? Because you're on track to be ordained with your class, but on the other hand, you spent an entire year and a half outside the seminary.
Right.
Now, it's funny because in the meantime, I continued to go back to visit my spiritual director periodically. So I couldn't quite break away from the seminary, and I couldn't quite make the commitment to get ordained. So, like I said, they really didn't know what to do with me.
Yes.
But the funny thing about it was, I remember it was the Saturday night of Thanksgiving weekend in 1987. And we went to St. Gertrude's Parish, which is in the east end of the city. My brother had some event that we had to go Sunday morning. So the thing was that we went to Mass Saturday night. So this is not our normal parish. And I remember struggling with this. I had been wrestling with this for a while now. And I walked over because they had, those stacks of candles that you light the candle, board of candle. So I went over, put the $2 in the thing and lit the candle. Knelt down, said a prayer. God, help me with this. And it's almost like God was on speed dial. And I could just hear this voice in my head saying, go back.
Wow.
That was the moment. That was the first step to becoming to St. Catharines. Of course, Oshawa was the Archdiocese of Toronto.
Right.
And so what I did was, I knew at the time, Father Greco taught me ethics. And he was the only person I knew. This guy, like, why St. Catharines? I had no idea. But I knew Father Greco. I went to him and said, look, I'd like to come back, but I'd like to change diocese. I'd like to get a fresh start. Would you approach, who at that time, it would have been Bishop Fulton, and ask him if he'd be interested in taking me? So he said, I can't make any promises. So we went to talk to Fulton, comes back to me, sees me the next week. He says, yeah, Fulton wants to interview. It'll be during the reading week at the end of October. So I drove down to St. Catharines. First time I actually was ever in St. Catharines. Drove through it enough times, but never gone to St. Catharines. Went to the office and he said, "Okay, I'm going to talk to you." We had an interview, an hour interview. He said, "I like what I hear. I've talked to the seminary. They're very high on you. So they think you have a vocation. I want to talk to my vocations director. At that time it was Monsignor Leo Clutterberg. And I'll talk to him about it and we'll get back to you." So early December, I think it was the first or second week of December, I got this letter in the mail. And it's from the Diocese of St. Catharines saying, "We accept you as a seminarian. You'll report in January of 1988 as a seminarian for this diocese." So I was all happy. So I went back to seminary, took that semester. Then they had to figure out, what are we going to do for a year in the parish? Because at that time, years in the parish were mandated, right? So here's what we're going to do. So Leo Clutterbuck worked it out with the bishop and everybody else. So Leo was pastor at St. Joe's Parish at the time. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to come and you're going to stay for the 4 months in the summer. So you're going to be there from the end of April until Labor Day. Okay. And we're going to evaluate you. At the end of that, then we'll decide what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I still had 2 courses left to take, integration and liturgy. Those are the only 2 courses I hadn't had yet. And they're required to get your degree and also to be ordained. So I spent my 4 months in St. Joe's in Grimsby and enjoyed it very much. When I arrived there, 28th of April of 1988, I knew 2 people in the Diocese of St. Catharines. One was the bishop and one was Monsignor Leo. I came here as a stranger. That line, as a stranger made me welcome.
Yeah.
So I come to St. Joe's Parish and everybody just falls all over the welcoming me. "Thank you for coming. We like you." Whatever. And it really, really, I felt so welcome. It's hard to explain it or describe it. But, I struggled a little bit in the month of July when everybody took off. But by Labor Day, I was pretty certain, this was a good move. Because all my friends in Toronto thought I was absolutely crazy. Why would you leave the great Archdiocese of Toronto to come out to the edge of the universe in St. Catharines? That's what they were. I had friends actually say that to me too. Guys I knew they were in formation in Toronto and friends in Toronto as well. Anyway, so what happens is I come back and then in September, I spent half a week in Grimsby visiting the hospital and schools and whatever. And then half the week I was in St. Augustine's taking those 2 courses.
Yes.
So I did that. And then March the 4th, 1989, remember that day very clearly, up at St. Augustine's, the chapel, I was ordained a deacon. And when people ask you for your anniversary, I always say March the 4th, because that was the day that something really profound happened. It seemed like at critical moments in my life, I had what I call an aha moment, a moment where everything snapped together. I remember it was early in the morning. It was like 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I always got up early. So I walk out down by the bluffs behind the seminary. This was at a time where you could go almost like right up the edge of the bluffs. So they got it all fenced off now. So, and I'm wrestling with it. That was it was around breakfast time. Anyway, the point is I went back to the back of the seminary and it was freezing rain that morning because there were guys from St. Peter's who were supposed to be ordained with us. So we were waiting for them and we figured, okay, we'll be lucky to get this thing started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I walk out to the edge of the bluffs and I'm looking across. Now I could not see Niagara. I mean, the weather was not good, but I kept thinking, do I really want to do this? This is it. This is the moment where the decision sticks. It's not like before where I could have changed my mind when I lit that candle. I could have changed my mind again, right?
That's true.
When I talked to Father Greco, all kinds of times where I could have, now I can't do it anymore. Now I got to make the decision. And I remember looking across, and again, I remember it was just one of those moments in the cold, in a bit of freezing rain, and it just snapped together. Yes, this is it.
Okay.
And that, people say, when did you know you were going to be a priest? That was really the moment. Wow. That was, if I had to pick out one moment, that's why that day, March 4th, is so special to me, 89. That's why that's my anniversary, because that's when the decision was made, even though it was only diaconate ordination. I guess I theoretically could have dropped out after being a deacon, but it would have been more complicated.
Right.
From then on, I came back to Grimsby for Holy Week, and I commuted back to the seminary for my courses during the week because Monsignor Leo wanted me here to, go through Holy Week, and all that stuff, which I did, which I enjoyed very much. Again, the people were very welcoming. There were a few people from Grimsby that actually came up to the ordination, which I greatly appreciated. My family was there, of course.
Wow.
And so anyway, Holy Week comes by, and then the seminary says, we think, like, when are we going to ordain you a priest? The seminary was saying, we're concerned that you're kind of rushing this. Like, I was full bore after March 4th. I was like, like straight line. I want to be ordained the next day after they let me go.
Yes.
They said, we're afraid you might be rushing it. We think you should wait till the fall. I said, why? Well, we can't give you a reason because there isn't one. Well, so I went to Fulton and said, like, on one hand, I want to get ordained, but on the other hand, they're recommending that I wait. But they don't really see, so it's okay, here's what we're going to do. You have to go up to South and do the psychological testing, whole day of psychological testing. Then you have to do an 8-day retreat in Guelph with the Jesuits. Fun. This probably would have been like March, April when they, So I go to Southdown for the day, and the report comes back. He's perfectly fine. He's not crazy. He knows what he's doing, which was kind of nice, because, when you hear about Southtown, they do a lot of rehabilitation treatment there, right? So, if you get good marks from Southtown, when they tell you you're normal, it makes you feel better.
Yes.
I went to Guelph, and did the 8-day retreat, came back. They wrote a letter to the rector saying they think he knows what he's doing. It's fine. So it was about the 1st of May, I think, when that happened. So then the bishop says, Dirk Peterson was being ordained on the 27th of May. You're going to be ordained that day. Fine. Okay with me. So I had 2 weeks. So a buddy of mine, a classmate of mine, Dave Fulton, in St. John, New Brunswick, was being ordained. So I actually got to his ordination. Most guys like to go to their classmate's ordination.
Yes.
That was the only one I was able to get to, sadly. Anyway, so I did go to that one. So that was nice. And then when I come home, like literally, it was a week or maybe even less than a week until the 27th of May. So, they're lining up the ordination mass, and and then of course the question became, well, like, how much, like, now that there's 2 of you, what are we going to have to change? I said, look, I've got somebody in Grimsby I'd like very much, young man who was in high school, I think at the time, high school. I said, I like him to do one of the readings, if that's okay, and maybe have my parents bring up the gifts of one with the parents of the other ordinandi. They said, fine. I was new there. Everybody kept looking. Who was that? Everybody kept coming to me. Who are you?
Yes.
At the cathedral.
Because you were kind of an unknown.
Well, I was. Oh yeah, I was an unknown quantity then.
Yeah.
And what happened was, it's interesting because what happened then was, I said, like, I just want to get ordained. Like, some guys make a big deal about their ordination. Now, I'm not saying ordination isn't important, but like, they spend hours looking at magazines, figuring out what chasuble they're going to wear, what chalice design they want, and all this other stuff, right? Like, all I want to do is, I hate to put it this way, I just want to get this over with. I just want to get ordained so I can get out there and serve the people of God. That's all I wanted. I did not want to fool around with what I thought were unimportant things. Now, some people it's important.
Yes.
So, so I got there. I arrived back in the diocese. It was about the 20th of May. 27th was the Saturday that I was going to be ordained. So I went back. Obviously, came straight to Grimsby and talked to Monsignor Leo about it. And also, we had the rehearsal on the 26th of Friday night. I went in. That's actually, I met all the people that were going to be there. And so we went through the rehearsal, and it all seemed pretty easy. And then May 27th, it's interesting because you know how they used to have the Folk Arts Festival Parade?
Yes.
That was the day of the Folk Arts Festival Parade.
Okay.
And coming down Church Street, because they blocked it off. So getting into the cathedral was a bit of a challenge. Okay. Anyway, coming down in the middle of Mass is a pipe band, bagpipes. Now I'm thinking, wasn't that nice that they invited the Queen's University pipe band? Because Queen's is only one of 2 universities in the whole country with a pipe band, right?
Wow.
Come down the street. So there, and I was being serenaded by I was remembering my fond memories of Queen's University. And it was funny because, and the rest of the day, like, it went well. I just, the Mass was a regular ordination mass, did all the things supposed to do. I didn't flub any lines. I didn't drop anything. I was a little nervous, but I mean, it was fine. And then I remember at the end, Monsignor Schaefer was a rector at the time, comes up and he says, Bishop Fulton wants you to say something up there. He said this to both myself and Derek. So I said, okay, and he said, you're going to go first. And like, this was out of the blue right now. As you know, I had no problem talking. So I got up there and I just said, thank the people for coming, thank my parents for all they did for me and whatever. Thank the people from Grimsby. And I remember just saying, briefly that, being a priest is a privilege. I understand that. And, it took maybe like, I was just trying, like, hurry up, say something and then get back down to your seat because I didn't want to say something dumb.
Yeah.
So, I said something like, it's a priesthood's a privilege. You don't earn it. You don't deserve it, but you get it. And I'm grateful for it. Forget what it was. I'd love to go back and hear what I said because apparently it was very profound. I don't remember much of it, but apparently people, that was just so nice what you said. So Derek got up there and he said his piece. And then we finished and then we went to the nice Columbus Hall for the reception that they had afterwards.
Yes.
And that was pretty well it. I mean, it's funny because if you want to sum up my vocation story very succinctly, I mean, you ever been to a place, you're at dinner, right? Somebody tells a joke. Everybody else at the table laughs except you. You don't get the joke. That's kind of how I feel it. I look back on my vocation because I think a lot of other people, I think some of the priests at my home parish, I think some of the priests in the seminary, I think maybe even my parents saw it because my parents never pressured me to be a priest, but they were fully supportive. A lot of people saw my vocation long before I did.
Yes.
And sometimes that happens. The challenge is, of course, is that, that later you think like, why didn't I see this? Why didn't I see all these little connections between all these little events in my life? They all make sense in hindsight, but at the moment you're in the middle of confusion and you don't understand it. It's just the way it is.
So building on that, I think you have a very beautiful vocation story, Father Michael, and I know I can speak for the listeners in thanking you for sharing it with us. So if I'm a young Mike Basque struggling to perhaps see my own vocation, what advice might you be giving to me, either as a male, perhaps discerning the priesthood, maybe a female discerning religious life, married life, single life? What advice would you give to a young person in a similar situation to know what God might be calling them to and respond accordingly?
I think the most important thing, you have to be comfortable in your own skin. What I mean by that is you have to know yourself. You have to know what you're good at, what you're not good at. You have to know your personality. This takes time. One of the things that I think we're doing a disservice to young people today in our society is we're pushing them. We want them to make decisions they're not equipped to make yet about their life, about their career. You've got kids in grade 8 that are stressing out about entering high school so they can go to university so that they can get a good job. They're not equipped to do that. You need to be, first of all, comfortable in your own skin. Know yourself. Get to know yourself really well. What works, what doesn't. What do you like to do? What are you good at? I always tell people that. Find out what you're good at. Find out what you like to do. And if the same thing is true for both, that's probably where God wants you to be. Take your time. Be patient with yourself. Don't let other people push you in a particular direction, as I was not pushed by anybody. But don't push yourself. Make sure that you're comfortable with what you do. Take your time. Go through things slowly. It might take you. I mean, look, it took me until I was 30 years of age to realize I was called to be a priest. Now, back in elementary school, I thought about it, but in a very kind of childish way. Even at university. I mean, I went to Queen's, I think I was 18. And that, all of a sudden, priesthood suddenly became a serious possibility. So, be comfortable in your own skin, take your time, learn about things, explore your options, and that's important because, there may be options out there that you're not even aware of, you're not thinking of. And I guess the last thing is, as I said, be patient with yourself, but, let it happen, let it unfold. Because, I really do think that it's very difficult sometimes to look at young people and they seem so stressed. They seem so wrapped up in they have to go to this university, and they have to get a good job, and they have to have a house, and they have to be married by this age and whatever. Like they're putting themselves in a timeline which is not healthy for them. God wants us to be the person he created us to be. God wants us to take the time to figure that out.
Right.
God wants us to be happy. If we really believe God, that's not just, oh, I feel happy today. Oh, it's so nice. But it's like that deep down happiness that says, that, yeah, this is why God put me on earth. This is where I fit in, and I think when you find that spot, when you see yourself that way, the way God sees, if you would see God the way you are, you would be happy.
Yes.
And I think that's something that's really, really, really critical, very, very important, because as I said, a lot of people today are really stressed out about things that, and, I think it's a tragedy. I mean, look at the world today. Look at youth suicide. Look at eating disorders. Look at mental issues among young people. They're skyrocketing. And I wonder if our society, it's a self-inflicted wound. If we just sort of let people be themselves and wouldn't put expectations on them, I think a lot of this would go away, and a lot of people would be a lot more happy, and they'd find their place in life. Oh, that makes sense. But
Father Michael, I can't thank you enough for being with us today and really unlocking for us the beauty of God's gift of your vocation, not only to the priesthood here in our great diocese, to which we both have the privilege of serving in, but I know you've impacted people in much greater places than our backyard too. So
yeah.
May God continue to bless you in your priesthood, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you. And I just have one more little thing to say. I'm really happy to be a priest because I really believe that's what God called me to be. And, I talked about earlier, but I can't tell you every day has been a joy. It hasn't been. There have been lots of struggles. My first year of priesthood was brutal, but I'll tell you, I really feel contented. I have high job satisfaction, if that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
For God's Playbook, friends, I'm Father Rico. God loves you, and so do I.
If you like what you hear, please consider supporting us using any of our affiliate links in the description below via Buzzsprout, Ko-Fi, or GoFundMe. Thanks, and God bless.